Thanks for joining me on another episode of Light and Darkness here on ABN, where we are beginning a new 5-part series on sacrifice in servanthood, focusing on 5 parables of Jesus, again, focusing on sacrifice and servanthood. Our first episode today is based on Luke 14, 7 through 14, where he talks about the lowest seat, and it reads like this. So he told a parable to those who were invited, when he noted how they chose the best places, saying to them, when you are invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man, and then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down in the lowest place, so that when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. Then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. For whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he also said to them who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you shall be repaid at the resurrection of the just. And it's important to note here the context in what Jesus is speaking. It says in a few earlier verses that Jesus walked into the house of the head of the Pharisees. So that was one of his primary audiences that he was talking to, and he may have also been there with a few of his disciples or all of his 12 disciples. But the first thing that he says, or one of the first things that he says, he notes that when you are invited to a wedding feast, so it shows some sort of exclusivity. So not everybody is invited to a wedding feast, but when you are. So when you are, which means that you're important or considered special, and then it goes on. So that's the first thing to note. The second thing he's saying, of course, that when you are invited, that when you've walked through the doors, don't take the best seat in the house, but in fact go and take the lowest seat. And why he's saying this? Because if you do go and take the highest seat from the start, in the beginning, as soon as you walk in, then there may be a chance that somebody greater than you will walk in the door, and the one who held this banquet would sort of go to you, maybe in a quiet voice, and say, somebody here is greater than you. We're going to have to ask you to move and maybe to a lower seat, and then you yourself will be embarrassed. So he's saying, from the beginning, humble yourself. From the beginning, understand that to be invited makes you special, but understand that once you're in the presence of this great banquet, don't immediately go and take the highest seat, because you may be asked to move to a lower seat. And the point of that, of course, is towards the end verse where he says, the main message, he says, for whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. And this is really the question for us, or the beauty of this parable, that where do we stand today? When we're invited to a great banquet, or when we're invited to be followers of Jesus, which that in of itself is a great honor, or a great a privilege to be called a follower of Christ, but to be representative of him, or to walk into this banquet, let's say, or to be in the presence of such glory, what is the first thing that we do? Do we humble ourselves, or do we praise ourselves? Do we uplift ourselves? And really, if we're uplifting ourselves, do we belong in the presence of such a humble king, that he himself humbled himself and tried to show us what it meant to be a humble king, or to be a king that sacrificed all. So those are the type of questions that will be healthy to ask ourselves as we call ourselves, or as we strive to strengthen our relationship with Christ and continue to grow as disciples of Jesus. But also what's important here is that it says, why did he give them this parable? In verse 7 it says, so he told a parable to those who were invited when, this is the important part, he says, when he noted how they chose the best places. So he had already observed the behavior of the Pharisees. He had already observed the behavior of the rulers of the Pharisees. He had already observed the behavior of whoever may have been around there. Maybe his disciples, maybe just people observing off the street walked in. Maybe it was just the leaders, the Pharisees or the rulers of the Pharisees. But whoever was there, he had already observed. And so he was saying that what I have observed, he was the one that was walking in the house. He was the one that was greater than them. He was the one that was trying to show them and tell them in love that, listen, you need to humble yourself because what I'm seeing in you are not attributes or behavioral characteristics of people who are with a humble spirit. But instead, I see a spirit of pride. Instead, I see a hard heart. Instead, I see you taking the best seat of the house. And in fact, either you do not know in whose presence you are in, or you do know and you have come to this conclusion that really your ignorance or your pride has blinded you from understanding in whose presence you are in. So he's saying, but in love, of course, he's saying, whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted. And as he's saying this, he is touching the heartstrings. He's pulling on the heartstrings of the Pharisees or of the rulers of the Pharisees, because he's saying it in love, and he's touching the conscience of those people who they themselves had exalted themselves in the presence of this humble king. So it was his way of sharing the truth in love, but also illustrating an example of the importance of staying humble, the importance of sacrifice, and the importance of understanding what it means to be a servant, what it means to be a follower of Christ, what it means to be called and to live out, to be a disciple of Jesus. So I think that those are the main parts of this parable. And the last part, actually, of the parable that I want to leave you with is that although Jesus walked in to this house, to the ruler of the Pharisees' house, in fact, if we pay attention, he's the one that created the banquet, quote unquote. He's the one that actually orchestrated the presence or the house or the timing of him to walk into the house of the Pharisees. So he's almost saying that when you walk into a house or when you walk into a banquet, take the lowest seat. But he's also trying to help them to understand that he's the one that is the author of this banquet. He's the one that is the greatest, without saying that he's the greatest, because he is a humble king, because he wants them to realize through touching their hearts that, listen, I'm sensing in you a spirit of that is contrary to the Spirit of God, even though you call yourself leaders of the temple or leaders of followers of God and so forth. But he's saying that I'm trying to tell you in love that what you're doing, how you're behaving, how you're acting is not consistent with the heart of God. And so that was a challenge to them, and it was also a live, I guess, a parable and a live testimony, and it was also an opportunity for those who may have been sitting around, perhaps his disciples, perhaps other people, perhaps whoever was watching, to understand the heart of God just a little bit more through this parable. So I thank you for joining me here on this first episode of the parable of the lowest seat regarding sacrifice and what it means to sacrifice with the heart of a servant. Thanks for joining me.